Some men are given a choice. Achilles was given two futures: live a long, quiet life and be forgotten, or die young at Troy and be remembered forever. He chose Troy. That single choice would decide everything that followed, not just for him, but for a city of thousands, a king who could not find his way home, and a war that would outlive every man who fought in it. This is the complete story of the Iliad and the Odyssey. 10 years of siege. 10 more years of the sea, one war, two heroes, an ending that neither of them saw coming. Welcome to Deep History Origins. An apple, a prince, and a promise. The war did not begin with soldiers. It began with a wedding no one wanted to ruin. On Mount Olympus, the gods gathered to celebrate a marriage. Every god was invited, every god but one. Eris, goddess of discord. Discord does not wait to be invited. She threw a golden apple into the feast. 4 words were carved into its skin: for the most beautiful. 3 goddesses reached for it at once: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of war and wisdom; Aphrodite, goddess of love. None of them let go. Zeus refused to choose between them. He was king of the gods. He was not foolish enough to pick a winner in a contest between 3 furious goddesses. So he handed the decision to a mortal, a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida. A Trojan prince named Paris had no idea his afternoon was about to reshape the world. Each goddess made her offer. Hera offered power, dominion over kingdoms, the fear and respect of every king alive. Athena offered wisdom and unmatched skill in battle. Aphrodite offered the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose the woman. For a young man standing between 3 goddesses, it was an easy decision. It was also the worst decision in the history of the ancient world, because the most beautiful woman in the world already belonged to someone else: Helen, queen of Sparta, wife of King Menelaus. Years before any of this, when Helen was still unmarried, half of Greece had arrived in Sparta to court her, each king armed, proud, and one insult away from starting a war right there in her father's hall. To prevent exactly that kind of bloodshed, every suitor had sworn an oath that whichever man Helen chose, all the others would defend that marriage against anyone who ever tried to break it. At the time, it had seemed like a clever piece of diplomacy. Nobody imagined it would one day summon 1,000 ships. That old oath did not stop Paris. He sailed to Sparta, sat at Menelaus's own table as an honored guest, and left with his wife. Menelaus called his brother, Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, commander of armies, the most powerful ruler in the Greek world. Agamemnon understood, instantly, what this meant. This was not an insult to one man. This was an insult that demanded a war, and now every king who had sworn that old oath was bound to answer it. 1,000 ships gathered at the port of Aeolus, the largest fleet the world had ever seen, pointed at a single city across the sea: Troy. Before the fleet even sailed, one of their finest young warriors was missing. A prophecy had warned that a man named Achilles would die if he ever went to Troy, so his mother hid him on the island of Scyros, dressed among the daughters of a foreign king, praying no one would find him. Odysseus found him anyway. He arrived disguised as a traveling merchant and spread out jewelry and fine cloth for the princesses to admire, with a sword and shield hidden among the trinkets. Then he had a war horn sounded, as if raiders had landed on the shore. Every princess in the room fled in terror. One of them reached for the weapons instead. Achilles had been found, and once found, no prophecy, no mother, and no disguise could keep him from the war he was fated to die in. They arrived at Troy, believing the war would be over before the year was out. 9 years too slow, as it turned out. The man who carried the war. Troy did not fall. Its walls had never been broken in 9 long years of siege, and the men who defended them, generation after generation of Trojan soldiers, knew exactly how to hold every stone of them against an army that had crossed an entire sea to take the city down. The only reason the Greeks had not already lost was one man, Achilles. While he fought, they won. While he rested, they survived. The entire campaign ran on the willingness of a single warrior to keep showing up. 9 years passed that way. 9 years of victories that were never quite enough to end the war, and never quite few enough to lose it. In those 9 years, Achilles had been given many honors. The most visible of them was a woman named Briseis, awarded to him as a mark of the glory the army owed him. That was the problem. Agamemnon commanded kings. Achilles commanded something more dangerous: admiration. Every honor Achilles received was a public reminder that the most powerful king in Greece was not the most important man in the camp. That was a wound the High King had never been able to forgive. Then plague came. It swept through the Greek camp like a quiet execution, killing men before they ever reached a battlefield. The gods were sending a message. Agamemnon had taken a priest's daughter, Chryseis, and refused to return her. The solution was simple: give her back. Agamemnon refused, not because he couldn't, because he did not want to. He was High King, and High Kings did not back down, not for priests, not for plagues, not for anyone. It was the first time the Greek army saw exactly who was leading them. It would not be the last. When the bodies piled high enough, Agamemnon finally agreed to return Chryseis. But not without a condition. If he had to give up what was his, someone else would lose something too. The insult that started a second war. Agamemnon did not hesitate. He stood before the entire army and announced it plainly. If Chryseis was being taken from him, then Achilles would give up Briseis, his prize, his honor, gone, by royal decree, in front of every man who had ever followed Achilles into battle. It was not theft, it was humiliation, delivered on purpose, in public. Something ignited in Achilles. 9 years of bleeding for this war. 9 years of victories that kept the Greek camp alive while lesser men took the credit. And now the man who had done the least fighting and demanded the most glory was standing in front of him, taking the one thing that was his. His hand went to his sword. Athena appeared then, visible only to him, unseen by anyone else in that crowded assembly. She seized him by the hair and held him back with a grip no mortal could have managed. Not here, not like this. There was a better way to make Agamemnon understand exactly what he had done, a way that would not end with a king's blood on Achilles' hands before the war had even truly turned. Achilles let go of the sword. Then he said something that would cost the Greeks everything. He was done fighting. Not for Agamemnon, not for this war, not for a king who repaid loyalty with theft. Turning from the assembly, he walked to the shore, sat down, and waited to watch the army that depended on him learn what it felt like to face Troy without him. The camp went quiet. Not the quiet of rest, the quiet of men who understood that something irreplaceable had just walked away. Only Patroclus, his closest companion, saw the wound underneath the anger. That night, Achilles called to his mother, the sea goddess Thetis, and asked her for one thing. Go to Zeus, ask him to let the Greeks suffer without me. Let them lose. Let Agamemnon finally understand the difference between a king and the man who made him one. Zeus listened. Zeus agreed. Without Achilles, everything changed. The Trojans, who had spent 9 years pinned behind their own walls, suddenly found something they had not had in a decade. Advantage, for the first time in a decade. The city that refused to fall. The Greeks still had kings. They still had thousands of men. They no longer had the one man Troy feared. At the front of the Trojan army rode Hector, son of Priam, prince of Troy, the man who carried the entire city on his shoulders. Hector was not Achilles. Achilles fought for glory. Hector fought because if Troy fell, he would lose everything he loved. Inside the walls, his wife Andromache waited. War had already taken almost everything from her. Now the only man she had left walked out to fight every single day. She found him once near the ramparts and asked him to stay. Not forever, just for today. Let someone else stand at the front. Hector listened, then answered honestly, with sadness in his voice. He could not hide behind other men while Troy fought for its life. He knew the city might fall one day. He knew war would eventually take everything. Not today, though. He reached for his infant son. The boy cried at the sight of his father's war helmet, and Hector laughed, forgetting the war for one brief moment, becoming only a man trying to comfort his child. Gently, he removed the helmet, held his son, and prayed the boy would grow to be greater than him. Then he handed the boy back to Andromache and walked toward the gates. She watched him go, knowing that every time Hector left, Troy survived a little longer, and she lost him a little more. The return of Achilles. Without their greatest warrior, the Greeks were not being destroyed all at once. They were being broken piece by piece. Hector was everywhere. The Trojans no longer fought like men trapped behind walls. They fought like men who remembered they could win. Agamemnon saw it. He hated seeing it, but he saw it. And the High King of Mycenae did the one thing his pride had never allowed before. He sent for Achilles. Not a command, an offer. Briseis returned untouched. Treasure, gold, cities, even one of his own daughters in marriage. Everything a king could give without kneeling. 3 men carried that offer to the shore. Odysseus, whose words could open doors no sword could break. Ajax, the giant warrior who understood battle better than speeches. And Phoenix, who had known Achilles since he was a boy. They found him sitting outside his tent with a lyre in his hands. Patroclus beside him, saying nothing. Odysseus laid out the offer with everything he had. Achilles listened to every word of it. Then he said no. The gifts meant nothing. The apology meant nothing. Agamemnon could offer 10 times as much and still not undo what had been done in front of the entire army. Let Agamemnon fight his own war, Achilles told them. Let him hide behind his kings, his speeches, and his prizes. The men who had come to save the army walked back to the ships knowing they had failed. Only Patroclus stayed close in the days that followed. He said little. He simply remained, not pushing, not pleading, just present, in the only way that mattered. Outside, the war kept getting worse. Hector drove the Trojans all the way to the Greek ships, the same ships that had carried them across the sea, the same ships meant to carry them home. Fire rose against the night sky, and still Achilles did not move. That was the moment Patroclus stopped watching in silence. He went to Achilles. He did not ask him to return. Pride had already sealed that door. He asked for something smaller, the armor. Just the armor. Let him lead the Myrmidons into battle wearing Achilles' weapons. The Trojans did not need to face the real thing. They only needed to see the name. Achilles agreed, on one condition. Drive them back from the ships, and return. Do not chase them toward the walls. Do not go looking for glory that isn't yours. Above everything, do not go near Hector. Patroclus promised. The night raid. Long before Patroclus ever put on that armor, the war had already shown what Odysseus was capable of when no one was watching. One night, with Achilles still refusing to fight and the Greek position growing desperate, Odysseus and the warrior Diomedes slipped past the sentries and out into no man's land between the camps. They were hunting information, not glory. They caught a Trojan spy named Dolon creeping the other direction, promised him his life in exchange for what he knew, and emptied him of every secret he had. Then they killed him anyway. What Dolon told them led straight to a newly arrived Trojan ally, a Thracian king named Rhesus, camped with his men and his famous white horses, still exhausted from the road, still unprepared for war. Odysseus and Diomedes crept through the sleeping camp and killed a dozen men without a sound, then drove off Rhesus's horses before the alarm ever went up. It was not the kind of victory sung about at feasts. There was no duel, no glory, no fair fight under the sun. It was simply effective, a warning of exactly what kind of mind Troy would eventually have to reckon with, long before that mind ever built a horse. The death that changed the war. The moment Patroclus rode out in Achilles' armor, the effect was immediate. The Trojans, who had been advancing with confidence, pulled back, uncertain, staring at a warrior they thought had not left his tent in weeks. Patroclus pushed them back from the ships, exactly as he had promised. But victory has a pull to it, the ground giving way beneath the enemy, the sense that today, right now, nothing can stop you. He kept going, deeper into Trojan lines than he had promised, further than was safe, not because he meant to betray Achilles, but because he believed, for one dangerous moment, that he might save him from his own fate. If he could break the Trojans here, if he could end the war before it ever came back around to Achilles, Apollo found him and warned him to stop. Patroclus did not listen. So the god struck him from behind. His strength drained, his helmet fell, his spear shattered. The armor that had made him look like Achilles became nothing more than borrowed metal on a man who could no longer defend himself. A Trojan spear found him first. He staggered, still alive, but the illusion was gone. The Trojans no longer saw Achilles standing before them. Hector arrived next and finished what the god had begun. With his last breath, Patroclus gave Hector one final warning. Achilles is coming. Rage. News of Patroclus's death reached Achilles at the shore. For a moment he did not move, did not shout, did not reach for a weapon. He simply broke. His mother rose from the sea without being called, and found her son with ash on his face, and his world already gone. There was nothing to say that could make it bearable, so she held him. When he finally spoke, there was only one name left inside him: Hector. His mother warned him what that meant. If he killed Hector, his own death would follow soon after. Achilles already knew. He had known since before he ever set foot at Troy. Live long and be forgotten, or die young and be remembered forever. Before, that had sounded like glory. Now it sounded like a sentence he was finally ready to finish. New armor arrived, forged by the god Hephaestus himself, a shield stamped with the sun and the stars and cities at both war and peace, made bright enough to make grown men look away. But there was nothing bright left in the man wearing it. He returned to the Greek assembly and ended the quarrel with Agamemnon, not because he had forgiven him, but because none of it mattered anymore. Briseis was returned. The gifts were given. The honor that had started this entire catastrophe was placed back at his feet. Too late. He felt nothing. He went back to war for one reason only. Patroclus was dead, and Hector was still breathing. The Trojans felt him coming before they ever saw him. Men who had held the line against Greece for 9 years broke at the sight of one man walking toward them. By the river outside the city, he cut through Trojans by the dozen, and even the river god himself rose up in fury at the number of bodies choking his currents, surging over the banks to try to drown the one man responsible. Achilles fought a river that day and survived it, dragged himself onto dry ground while the water roared behind him. Hector waited outside the walls. From above, his father and mother begged him to come inside. Every voice that loved him told him not to face Achilles alone. He knew they were right. His pride would not let him listen. He was Hector, son of Priam, prince of Troy, and if the city was watching, he could not be seen running. Then Achilles appeared. For one moment, Hector held his ground. Then he truly saw him, and he ran. He circled the walls of Troy 3 times with Achilles hunting him from behind, the entire city watching from above. This was not a duel, it was death, closing the distance. Athena deceived him, appearing in the shape of his own brother, promising he would not stand alone. Hector stopped, turned, threw his spear. It struck Achilles' shield and failed. He looked for his brother. No one was there. The gods had left him. But Hector would not die running. He drew his sword and charged forward to meet it. Achilles knew every weakness in the armor Hector wore, because it had once been his own. He found the gap and drove his sword through. Hector fell. With the last of his strength, he asked for one thing: "Let my body be returned to my family, so they can bury me." Achilles refused. He tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy while the entire city watched its greatest defender pulled through the dust by the man who had finally broken him. The father who knelt. Achilles was not finished with his grief, even after Hector was gone. He gave Patroclus his funeral. A massive pyre was raised, offerings placed, 12 captured Trojan sons killed at the flames in a fury no one tried to stop, and Achilles cut a lock of his own hair and set it in his friend's hands, the last gift he would ever give him. Afterward, he honored Patroclus one more way, the way warriors of that age always did. He staged funeral games, chariot races, wrestling, archery, boxing. prizes handed out to the living while the dead man's ashes cooled beside them, a strange and very human mixture of grief and celebration that the whole camp seemed to need. None of it brought Patroclus back. None of it quieted the rage still living inside Achilles. For 12 days, every morning, he dragged Hector's body through the dust again. Inside Troy, the city mourned a son, a husband, a father, and a defender it could not even bury. From the walls, King Priam watched his son's body pulled through the dirt, day after day, unable to stop it. On the 12th night, Priam made a decision everyone around him called madness. He would go to Achilles himself, alone, unprotected, and ask for his son's body back. The gods guided him safely through enemy lines, past the Greek camp, into the tent where Achilles sat with his grief and his victory, and the emptiness between them. Priam knelt at his feet. He took Achilles' hands and kissed them, the hands of the man who had killed his son. Then he asked Achilles to remember his own father, waiting far away in Greece, who might never see him come home either. Achilles looked at the old king kneeling before him, and something inside him broke open. He wept, for his father, who might never see him return, for Patroclus, who he could not bring back, for the old king kneeling in front of him, asking for the one thing every father deserves to give his son, a goodbye. Two enemies sat together in the dark, held by the same grief. Achilles raised Priam from the floor and gave him his son's body back. He gave him something more, time, enough for Hector to receive the honors he deserved, and for Troy to say goodbye before the war resumed. Troy buried its hero. The fall of the unbreakable city. When the war resumed, Achilles' rage had not faded. If anything, it drove him deeper, as if enough killing could finally give him what revenge had not. An army of warrior women arrived to fight alongside Troy, led by their queen, Penthesilea, and Achilles cut through them as he had cut through everyone else. Only after she fell did he lift her helmet and see her face, and for one strange moment, something close to grief passed through him for an enemy he had never even spoken to. Then, from a distance, Paris saw his chance to avenge his brother. He took aim and let the arrow fly. Guided by the god who had watched this war from the beginning, it struck the one place Achilles could not survive, his heel. The greatest warrior who had ever lived fell outside the walls of the city he had given everything to destroy. Silence fell across the battlefield, as if the war itself needed a moment to understand what had just happened. The Trojans tried to claim his body. Ajax held them back while Odysseus lifted the fallen warrior from the dust, and together they carried him home. An argument broke out almost immediately over who deserved his armor, the great prize of the war, forged by a god. Ajax believed strength had earned it. Odysseus argued that cunning had done more to keep the army alive. The vote went to Odysseus, and Ajax, humiliated in front of the entire camp, took his own life rather than live with the shame of losing. The Greeks gave Achilles a funeral worthy of a hero. The prophecy that had followed him since childhood was finally completely fulfilled. His name would never be forgotten. But Troy was still standing. Someone else would have to finish what Achilles started. That man was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, known not for his strength, but for his mind. He had an idea, not a battle plan, a trick, a wooden horse, enormous, hollow, large enough to hide the finest Greek soldiers inside its belly, beautiful enough that the Trojans would want to bring it home themselves. Nobody believed it would work. It did. The Greeks pretended to retreat, leaving the horse behind on the beach like an offering to the gods, sailing out of sight over the horizon. Suspicion came first from the walls, then curiosity, then something close to pride. A priest named Laocoon warned them not to trust it and hurled a spear into its side, and moments later, two enormous serpents rose from the sea and killed him and his sons in front of the entire city. The Trojans took it as a sign from the gods. They dragged the horse inside their own gates. That night, Troy celebrated the end of a war that had lasted 10 years. While the city slept off its own victory feast, the gates opened from within. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. Flames swallowed the sky. Streets that had held against every Greek assault for a decade burned in a single night. It was not the fall of a city, it was the erasure of a world. Priam fell. Helen was taken back. The most powerful city in the ancient world was reduced to ash and silence. Odysseus had won. It was the greatest moment of his life. When the fires of Troy finally faded behind him, there was only one thing left on his mind. Not glory, not the war, not even the men he had lost. One face, one name. Penelope, his wife, who had been waiting 10 years. He wanted to go home. Little did he know the gods were still watching, and not all of them were satisfied. The world doesn't welcome you back. Poseidon, god of the sea, was furious. The Greeks had not simply won a war, they had desecrated temples, insulted the gods, and mistaken heaven's favor for their own greatness. The sea waiting for Odysseus was not the same one he had crossed 10 years earlier. His first stop was the coast of the Sirens, allies of Troy. The correct move was simple. Keep sailing, stay invisible. 10 years of discipline collapses the moment the fighting stops, and his men had been at war for 10 years. They raided the nearest town, took everything they could carry, and camped on the beach to celebrate. Odysseus told them to leave before dawn. They did not listen. Reinforcements arrived from inland. By the time his men reached the ships, 72 of them were dead, not killed by monsters, not killed by gods, killed by their own inability to recognize when the war was over. A storm pushed them off course for 2 days. When it cleared, they found a shore filled with the scent of strange flowers, the land of the lotus eaters. The people there offered his men a taste of what they lived on, sweet, soft, unlike anything they had eaten before. Piece by piece, the men who ate it forgot about home, not all at once, but the mission, the ships, everything they had been sailing toward, replaced by a warm, comfortable nothing. Odysseus dragged them back to the ships by force and ordered the fleet to move before anyone else could taste the flowers. He understood the pull. After everything they had survived, forgetting sounded like relief. Every time he closed his eyes, though, he saw Penelope waiting, and as long as she was waiting, he had no right to stop moving. The cave of the Cyclops. Running low on food, they spotted a larger island across a narrow strait. Caves along the hillside, smoke rising from inland, signs of life. Odysseus wanted to know what kind. He took 12 of his best men and crossed at dawn, following the sound of movement into the hills, until they found a cave large enough to shelter ships. Enormous clay pots of milk, wheels of cheese stacked to the ceiling, pens of lambs sorted by age. Whoever lived here was not a man. His men wanted to grab the food and leave. Odysseus wanted to see who lived there. That decision would cost him everything. The Cyclops returned at evening, a single massive eye, a body the size of a hillside, moving boulders the way a man moves furniture. He sealed the cave entrance with a stone 100 men could not have shifted, and only then noticed his guests. His name was Polyphemus, son of Poseidon. Odysseus explained they were travelers, protected by the laws of hospitality. Polyphemus answered by grabbing 2 of his men and eating them where they stood. No negotiation, no escape. The stone was immovable. They were trapped with a monster who intended to eat them all. So Odysseus started thinking. He found a massive wooden stake, sharpened its point, and waited. When the Cyclops returned again, Odysseus offered him wine. Strong, undiluted. Polyphemus drank and asked his guest's name. Odysseus smiled. "My name is Nobody." The Cyclops laughed and promised as a gift that nobody would be eaten last. Then the wine dragged him down into sleep. Odysseus drove the sharpened stake into his single eye. The scream shook the cave. Polyphemus tore the stake free and screamed for his neighbors, who came running from across the island, calling through the sealed entrance, asking who had hurt him. "Nobody," he screamed. "Nobody is killing me." The other Cyclopes shrugged and walked away. By morning, blinded, Polyphemus rolled the stone aside to let his flock graze, running his hands along their backs to make sure no man escaped with them. What he did not check was underneath. Odysseus and his men clung to the wool of the rams and rode out of the cave to freedom. The escape was flawless. Odysseus ruined it. As the ships pulled away, safe, out of reach, pride became louder than reason. He stood at the stern and shouted back to the shore, "My name is Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. Remember it." Polyphemus did not curse him blindly. He raised his hands to the sky and called out to his father, Poseidon, asking that Odysseus never reach home, or if he did, that he arrive alone, broken, on a stranger's ship, with nothing but suffering waiting for him. Poseidon heard every word. Odysseus had just made the most powerful enemy in the world, not with a mistake, not with a crime, with his own name, the Bag of Winds. The sea felt different after that. For a while, though, luck seemed to change. They reached the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who welcomed Odysseus into his home, and, at the end of his stay, gave him a gift. Every wind in the world, sealed inside a leather bag. Only the west wind was left free, enough to carry them straight home. For 9 days they sailed without stopping. On the 10th, they could see it, the coastline of Ithaca. Odysseus finally let himself rest. That was his mistake. His men had been whispering for days, convinced the bag held gold. Odysseus was hiding for himself. The moment his eyes closed, they opened it. Every wind in the world burst out at once. The storm threw the fleet backward across the sea, as if 9 days of sailing had never happened. They landed exactly where they started, at the island of Aeolus, who took one look at them and turned them away, wanting nothing to do with men the gods had clearly marked for destruction. There was nothing left to do but row. They reached a bay called Laestrygonia, sheltered by steep cliffs, and most of the fleet sailed straight in. Odysseus, uneasy, anchored outside. He sent 3 men to investigate. They found a girl who led them to her father, a king the size of a mountain, who grabbed one of them and ate him on the spot. What followed happened too fast to stop. The Laestrygonians, giants, hundreds of them, lined the cliffs and hurled boulders down onto the trapped ships below, crushing them one by one, spearing the swimming survivors like fish. Odysseus cut his own anchor line and escaped before the giants turned toward him. 11 ships, gone. Hundreds of men, in minutes. He had left Troy with 12 ships. Now he had 1. The Witch of Aeaea. They reached an island called Aeaea, smoke rising from the trees. Odysseus split his men into 2 groups, sending one inland under a man named Eurylochus. Only Eurylochus came back, shaking, barely able to speak. A beautiful woman had welcomed them, fed them, and then turned every one of them into pigs. Her name was Circe. She was not a woman, she was a goddess. Odysseus went in alone. On the path, the god Hermes appeared and handed him an herb that would make him immune to her magic. When Circe's wand had no effect on him, something shifted in her. Not fear, recognition. She returned his men to human form and offered the entire crew something they had not known since Troy. Rest. They stayed a year. Not by force. Simply because, for the first time in a decade, they were safe. One morning, Odysseus woke and felt the pull again. Penelope, Ithaca, home. Circe did not argue, but she told him something that stopped him cold. Before he could go home, he had to go somewhere else first. The land of the dead. To speak with the ghost of a blind prophet named Tiresias, the only one who could tell him how to survive what still lay ahead. The land of the dead. Nobody goes to the underworld willingly. Odysseus went anyway. He sailed to the edge of the world, dug a pit in the earth exactly as instructed, poured his offerings, and waited. They came almost immediately, shadows rising by the dozens, then hundreds pressing toward the blood, the only thing that could make them remember what it felt like to be alive. He held them back with his sword until Tiresias arrived. The old prophet told him everything that lay ahead, the cattle of the sun god, which his men must never touch, the suitors already consuming his palace in Ithaca, the long road still between him and home. Then came his own mother, who he did not know had died. He tried to hold her, and his arms passed through smoke. The heroes of Troy followed, Agamemnon, killed by his own wife the night he returned home, warning Odysseus to trust no one, not even the people waiting for him. Achilles, telling him he would rather be the lowest servant among the living than king over all the dead. Ajax, still furious over the armor, who turned and walked away without a single word. Odysseus listened to every one of them, standing at the border between the living and the dead, and did not look away. He had what he came for. Now he only had to survive long enough to use it. The Sirens and the Strait. Before he left, Circe warned him of everything waiting ahead, sparing him no detail, because the only thing more dangerous than knowing what was coming was facing it unprepared. First, the Sirens. Creatures whose song was not simply beautiful, it was personal, offering each listener exactly what he most wanted to hear. Every man who heard it steered toward the rocks and died. Odysseus had his men fill their ears with wax, then ordered them to bind him to the mast. He needed to hear it. When the song reached him, he screamed at his men to release him, begged them, strained at the ropes until his wrists bled. They heard nothing, and rowed on exactly as instructed, until the island disappeared behind them. Next came the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallowed the sea whole 3 times a day, and a 6-headed monster embedded in a cliff face, close enough that avoiding one meant sailing within reach of the other. There was no way through without losing men. Odysseus chose Scylla. A whirlpool could take the whole ship. 6 heads could only take 6 men. He told his crew about the whirlpool. He did not tell them about the monster. 6 of his men were snatched from their benches mid-stroke, calling his name as they vanished into the cliff. He watched, and did nothing, because there was nothing to do. The cattle of the sun. They landed on Thrinacia, island of the sun god Helios, where his sacred cattle grazed. Both Tiresias and Circe had given the same warning. Do not touch them. The men swore an oath. Then the winds died, and for a month the fleet sat stranded, supplies running out, the oath slowly turning from a promise into a suggestion. One afternoon, while Odysseus prayed alone, his men slaughtered the cattle. The winds returned the next day, as if the sea had been waiting for exactly this. They sailed out. For a few hours, everything seemed fine. Then the sky turned black. Zeus split the ship's mast with a bolt of lightning. It was not a shipwreck. It was an execution. Every man who had sailed with Odysseus from Troy, who had survived 10 years of war and impossible odds, was gone within minutes. Odysseus clung to wreckage through the night, alone on an ocean that had taken everything he had left. For 9 days he drifted. On the 10th, a shore appeared. He did not know where he was. He only knew one thing: alive. That was the only thing he knew for certain. 7 years on a golden prison. The island was called Ogygia, and the woman who found him there was not going to let him leave. Her name was Calypso, not a monster, a goddess, ancient and beautiful, genuinely in love with the man the sea had brought to her. She offered him something no mortal had ever been offered: immortality, eternal youth, a life with no death and no loss. All he had to do was stay. Odysseus refused. Every morning he walked to the edge of the island and stared west, thinking of Penelope, of a son who had been an infant when he left and was now a man he had never met. 7 years passed that way, until Zeus finally sent Hermes with an order: release him. Calypso did not argue. She helped him build a raft and gave him fair winds. For 17 days the sea stayed calm. Then Poseidon found him. The storm that followed tore the raft apart in minutes. Odysseus swam for 2 days before a shoreline finally appeared through the waves. He dragged himself onto the beach and lay still. No ship, no crew, no name anyone here would recognize. Land, though. That was one step closer to home. While Ithaca waited, while Odysseus fought to survive, his home was falling apart without him. A king who had been gone 20 years might as well not exist. Into that vacuum walked the suitors, dozens of noble sons, convinced Odysseus was dead, certain that whoever married his widow would inherit his kingdom. They moved into his palace, ate his food, drank his wine, treated his home as their own, year after year. Penelope held them off the only way she could. weaving a burial shroud by day, unraveling it by night, buying 3 years with nothing but a loom and a lie, until a servant betrayed her secret. His son, Telemachus, had grown into a young man surrounded by strangers who mocked his father's name. Athena appeared to him disguised as an old family friend and told him what he needed to hear. His father was alive. It was time to act. Telemachus sailed in secret before the suitors could stop him, first to the court of old Nestor at Pylos, a man who had fought at Troy and talked about it endlessly, offering hospitality and memories, but no real news of Odysseus. From there he travelled on to Sparta, to Menelaus and Helen themselves, restored now to their old life and their old palace, as though the war that tore 2 continents apart had simply been a bad season. Menelaus told him what he knew. Odysseus was alive, stranded somewhere on an island, held against his will by a goddess who would not release him. It was enough. Telemachus turned his ship home, carrying the first real news of his father in 20 years. The suitors had already found out about his voyage, and it enraged them. A son, acting like a king's son, gathering allies, gathering information, becoming exactly the kind of threat they had assumed a boy raised without his father could never become. They armed a ship of their own and set it waiting in the strait between Ithaca and the mainland, planning to end the matter permanently before Telemachus ever reached his own harbour. He had no idea an ambush was waiting for him. Athena did, and she was not about to let the son die on the very voyage that had finally made him his father's equal. The beggar king, Odysseus washed ashore among the Phaeacians, found on the beach by a young princess named Nausicaa, who had come to the river with her handmaids to wash linens, and found instead a wild, salt-crusted stranger emerging from the reeds. She gave him clothes and pointed him toward her father's palace, and told him exactly how to win the favour of the queen. The royal court received him well. That night, at a feast in his honour, a blind court singer performed songs of the Trojan War, the wooden horse, the fall of the city, the fame of a certain cunning king of Ithaca, and the stranger at the table wept quietly into his cloak, moved by hearing his own life sung back to him by someone who did not know his name. Pressed to explain his tears, Odysseus finally told them who he was, and then told the entire hall everything: the Cyclops, the winds, the witch, the dead, the monsters, the years lost to the sea, the whole impossible story, delivered by the one man who had lived through every page of it. When he finished, the Phaeacians gave him a ship, loaded with more treasure than he had ever carried out of Troy, and sent him home. He fell asleep during the crossing, and did not wake until the ship touched the sand of Ithaca. Athena met him there, and told him what waited inside his own palace. Dozens of men who would kill him the moment they recognized him. So she changed him. With a touch, she aged his skin, bent his posture, hid his strength beneath the appearance of a beggar. 20 years of war and wandering, and he was finally standing on the soil of Ithaca, unrecognizable in his own kingdom. On the road to the palace, an old dog lay forgotten by the gate, thin, neglected, nearly gone. His name was Argos. Odysseus had raised him as a puppy before sailing for Troy, and had left before the dog was old enough to hunt beside him. No man in Ithaca recognized the king beneath the disguise. Argos knew him instantly. His ears lifted, his tail moved weakly against the ground. Odysseus turned his face away and wiped a tear, unable to reveal himself, and walked on toward the palace without looking back. Behind him, Argos lowered his head, closed his eyes, and died. He had waited 20 years to see his master come home. He finally had. Inside the hall, the suitors mocked the old beggar, threw a stool at him, laughed at his presence. Another beggar in the hall, resentful of the competition for scraps, even challenged him to a fist fight, and immediately regretted it when the old man's fists moved with a speed and force his appearance had never suggested. Odysseus watched, counted, and memorized every face and every weapon in the room. Penelope sent for him. He told her a careful lie woven through with truths only Odysseus could know. That night, an old servant washing his feet found a scar on his thigh she had known for 40 years and nearly cried out. He caught her wrist. "Not yet," he said quietly. The Return of the King, Penelope announced a contest. Whoever could string Odysseus's old bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads in a row would become her husband. The suitors tried, one after another, and failed. Some could not even bend it. While they were distracted, Odysseus revealed himself to 2 loyal servants and gave them their orders. "Lock the doors, secure the weapons room, let no one leave." Then the old beggar asked if he might have a turn. The suitors laughed. Odysseus picked up the bow, strung it in one smooth motion, and sent an arrow clean through all 12 axe heads without touching a single one. He looked up. The beggar was gone. What stood in his place was the king of Ithaca. Arrow after arrow found its mark. Not a fight, but a reckoning. When the quiver emptied, he drew his sword. When it was over, the hall was silent except for the sound of breathing. Home. Penelope did not run to him. She had been fooled by hope before, and she was not about to trust it again without proof. She tested him, telling a servant to move the marriage bed out of its chamber for the stranger to sleep in. Odysseus reacted before he could stop himself. That bed could not be moved. He had built it himself, carved from a living olive tree that still grew through the floor of their room. Its roots ran into the earth. No one alive knew that but the 2 of them. Penelope heard him describe it, and something locked inside her for 20 years came open all at once. She crossed the room and held him. This time, he did not pull back. They talked through the entire night, filling in everything that had been left unsaid for 2 decades. He had survived Troy, the Cyclops, the Sirens, the land of the dead, 7 years of captivity, and a sea that had tried to kill him more times than he could count. In the days that followed, he made one more journey, out to the small farm where his father, Laertes, had spent years in mourning clothes, sleeping in ashes, growing old on grief alone. Odysseus tested him first, the way he had tested everyone else on this island, with another careful lie about a stranger who had once known his son. When the old man's sorrow finally broke through the disguise entirely, Odysseus could not keep it up any longer, and told him the truth. Laertes reached out and touched his son's face, as if he still did not quite believe it, and then he did. It had taken 20 years. It had cost him everything he sailed with. 600 men, 12 ships, a decade of his son's childhood, and a version of himself that had left for Troy, young and certain, and had come home older than his own father remembered. Athena moved once more through Ithaca, quieting the grief-stricken families of the dead suitors before their anger could spiral into a war the island could not survive. Not with force this time, with exhaustion, and with the simple, undeniable fact that the king had returned, and that whatever came next would have to be built on something other than revenge. The island went quiet, sitting in his own home, in his own chair, beside the woman he had crossed the entire world to return to. It was, at last, enough. This has been Deep History Origins. If this story pulled you in, there's more of the ancient world waiting. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.